also need empirical support. So there, in the past, scientists even have been pessimistic about whether you can even become happier, right? So a lot of scientists thought you can't even become happier. So one set of evidence comes from studies in behavioral genetics showing that, whether that's my 10-month-old little baby there, showing that there's a genetic component to happiness. So calling it a set point might seem a little extreme, but anyway, happiness is genetically influenced. We all know that, but when you look around you, some people just are happier naturally than others. They don't have to work hard at it. Studies show that identical twins who share 100% of their DNA are much more alike in their happiness levels than our fraternal twins who share 50% of their DNA. So there's definitely a genetic component to happiness. That doesn't mean that you're doomed or fated to be happy, but that it's there. We also know from research in the field of personality psychology that happiness is part of your personality. And personality is really hard to change. Think about the people in your high school class, say, who were the most happy or the most extroverted or the most neurotic. If you met them today at a reunion, probably the ranks are going to be pretty similar. The most extroverted or neurotic people back then are probably still the sort of in the high, the most today as well. So personality doesn't change that much over the life course. It does somewhat, but not a lot. And so if happiness is part of your personality, then sort of how can you change it? And another reason to be pessimistic about increasing happiness is, we already talked about this, hedonic adaptation, right? We adapt to almost everything positive that happens to us, right? So we get married and then we adapt to that, right? We buy new things, we adapt to that. So, how can you become happier if you get used to everything and take it for granted? So obviously, I don't think this pessimism is, so damning. I think it's a little bit unwarranted. So here's kind of my argument in a nutshell, kind of a quick nutshell. I argue that despite the finding that our happiness is partially genetically influenced, and despite the finding that our life situations only sort of have a much smaller influence on our happiness than we think, I still argue that a large portion of our happiness is under our control. And I say in my book, The How of Happiness, that it's about 40%. People have taken that number way too seriously. So basically, just think about it as kind of a largish number, right? 40% is sort of it's an average based on lots of estimates from past studies. So just the take-home message is that there's this part of our happiness that's under our control that we can change. And so here's my little, maybe I should stop showing this, but here's my pie chart of happiness. So when you ask the question, what determines happiness, about half of the individual differences are due to genetics, and about 10% to life circumstances, and that leaves about 40%. So what we can do, the ways that we think, the ways that we behave, that can change our happiness. So again, these numbers are just estimates, and they kind of influence each other, and these numbers have to do with individual differences in happiness. So 40% of Shane's happiness is not up to him. These are statements about whole populations. Anyway, the bottom line is that there is something that we can all do to become happier. So what can we do to be happier? You all know the answer. There are probably 100 things that you can do to become happier. These are just a sample of happiness increasing strategies that have been studied by researchers. You can try to learn to forgive, to savor, to nurture your relationships, to practice your religion, to express gratitude. Again, there are 100 things that I could write down that you can do. This is not a surprise to anyone, right? Unless you've been living in a cave, you've seen this. So the contribution of my own lab, my own research, is that we sort of systematically test these strategies in the laboratory. So that's what I do. And people are surprised to learn that I'm not actually really that interested in what makes people happy, but in how and why. Okay, so I do what are called interventions. So interventions are basically experiments where people are kind of instructed, encouraged to make a positive change, and then we sort of follow them across time. So interventions are kind of like clinical trials, right? So in clinical trials, medical researchers might test a new drug to see if it works. But instead of testing a new drug, I'm testing a positive activity, like expressing gratitude. Now, clinical trials also will test things like, what's the right dosage of the drug? Should it be taken in combination with other drugs? Should certain individuals stay away from this drug? And so similarly, I also test kind of what's the right dosage of gratitude? You know, should certain people not express gratitude? So I kind of do the same type of research.